And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Please join me and my guest on this next interview. Central Europe is grappling with the devastating flood crisis, with Poland hit particularly hard. Torrential rains have caused rivers to burst their banks, submerging towns and forcing mass evacuations. With at least 16, now updated to 17, dead across the region, including 7 in Poland, question arises about the role of climate change and human activity in these extreme weather patterns. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these critical issues is Szymon Malinowski, Director of the Institute of Geophysics at the University of Warsaw. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Hello.
First, can you help us understand how unprecedented are these floods compared to past natural disasters in Poland? Is it something to be expected, or is it something relatively new?
First, we have to mention that it happened in a different time of the year than previous events like this. Usually in September, precipitation is much lower and temperatures are also much lower. I said are, but they were. And this is the sign of the climate change. So the high temperatures of Mediterranean, very high record high temperatures of the Mediterranean, contribute to this disaster, since, you know, the Mediterranean Sea is the body of water which supplies this kind of low pressure systems with water vapor, which then condensates and falls down in the areas. So generally, this low pressure system is something that happens. Floods happen, but the time of the year and the amount of water which fell down in this particular event is greater than it used to be in past climate. The first attribution studies say that it was very unlikely in the past climate to have such extreme event, and even if the precipitation would be 20% less. So this is the global influence of human activities. Local influences, there are many local influences, since we usually think that the only way to fight with flooding is to make hydrotechnical investments in a large scale. But with flooding, the problem occurs when the water gets down to the rivers quickly. If we can stop at least part of the water or slow down the flow into the rivers in the place when the water was deposited, then you reduce the flood, the maximum height of level of water. And in this respect, we have many things which should be improved. I'm saying about, so-called natural retention in the mountains.
All right, there are a lot of aspects going into this, and like you mentioned, there's a lot of scientific backing of what you mentioned that has to do with these floods. So can you tell us if this technological advancement nowadays in weather forecasting and climate science can offer more precise early warnings?
Oh, it was very precise early warning compared to past events. Generally, we knew 5 times in advance that might be a very heavy, difficult situation. And I think that from what I know, many actions have been undertaken. But the problem is that we are always prepared for the past, not for the future events. So generally, this events is different and more intense than past events. So if we do not anticipate the fact that with increased global warming, these events will be more often stronger, and we will not take measures. For instance, in some regions, I think that it would be worth of considering whether we should build some new infrastructure in some regions, not in terms of hydrotechnological infrastructure, but in terms of roads, of sport facilities, tourist facilities, high in the mountains, and whatever. Since this contributes to what happens downhill.
Right, like you mentioned, a lot of these flooding could probably be made worse by human activities like urban planning and deforestation. How is that observed? Is that the same case here in Poland?
This is too early to say something definitely, but there are some signs that there were, more. Of course, there was much development since last years. Also in the flooded areas, these areas which should be not, developed. And there were a lot of development higher in the mountains. And we do not take seriously, the risk of even dramatic events which happen not every year, but from time to time. And we don't account it in planning. It's not only a Polish problem, it's a kind of more general problem. And we say that we should adapt to the climate change, but we cannot adapt to something changing faster and faster. We can adapt to some kind of more or less constant, but climate changes faster and faster due to our emissions. And of course, adaptation can mitigate somehow the effects of flooding like this, but we should be more focused on preventing this kind of events, and the best prevention is reduction of greenhouse gases, and the second is the conservation of nature in the critical areas, since we have to work with nature, limiting effects of such disasters, not against the nature.
All right, you mentioned that there are many things that could be done if people are taking these risks a little bit more seriously, where people aren't really doing now as a more global level. What are some of the more practical steps that, be it government, be it local communities, can take better to mitigate the situation on perhaps like a micro scale, like you mentioned, perhaps have these plans involved when it comes to building infrastructure, and on a more macro scale, like also you mentioned the reduction of these greenhouse gases. How do you think these practical steps can be taken to alleviate or mitigate these situations?
Generally, we don't count the possible, losses from improper land use and urbanization. We usually account for short-term inflow of cash into the investments or local governments or the government pockets. And we do not pay enough attention in the optimization, long-time, let us say, economical optimization of our activities. Since generally these activities should, improve our life and bring bigger safety. But as you see, this is a kind of not the final effect. So generally, we should account for environmental services, of the loss of environmental services like flood protection by, for instance, virgin forests or properly managed forest, with particular attention being paid to the protective part of the functions of the forest. And we cannot say that every piece of land which could be built because of it is, looks sometimes useful, that we could make it, should be built. You can see examples of some places where definitely buildings should not appear. And generally, it's easy to do this, since there are maps, they are services which should help us, but short-term thinking is prevailing.
Right, so it does seem like people do have to strike a balance between the short-term effects and the long-term consequences. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.